So Icom's announcement of the IC-905 has generated some significant interest amongst the ham community over the last few days. Now, I did a couple of videos, including one which was a comment video on the initial release. Now, I had quite a few comments on that video. They were repeating some of the same questions. So what I wanted to do was try and answer some of those questions. And also I wanted to show some of your comments as well, because there are some general comments which I think are very interesting and productive when it comes to the release of the IC-905. But first off, I wanted to just show some extra photos from the Tokyo Hamfair. These were released by Icom Japan on their Twitter page, and they kind of fill in the dots in regards to a couple of questions that some people did have. If we have a look at the first photo, you can see this is a nice crisp looking photo with 10 gigahertz. So one thing that I didn't cover in the initial video that I've done is whether you'd be able to display the real frequency range, and it looks like you can display at least 10 gigahertz on the screen. So that's pretty good. I was very happy about that. So here's the overall setup. So you can see they've got it mounted here on a pole. They've got a couple of the antennas, so the AH56, the AH24 for 2.4 and 5.6, and also the 10 gig transverter hooked up to a pretty cool looking dish here, and then there's a tri-band vertical at the top here, and all the marketing information here as well. But there is a photo, which is this one, which is more of an overall view, which I think we should have a look at in more detail. So if I blow this up here, you can see if we start off at the reference unit, or the RF module unit, which is mounted on the pole, you can see here that the connections that are currently coming out of the top, one of the questions that was asked was, well, if 10 gigahertz is driven from 2.4, can you still use 2.4 gigahertz? And I think that this photo answers that question. As you can see here, this port here, which is an SMA port, is the 2.4 gigahertz output. You can see this hard line runs up and around and then into the 10.4 gigahertz transverter, which is the 10.4 gig transverters using it as using 2.4 as an IF. And you can see here that there's another output. So that output there is going along another piece of hard line to the 2.4 gigahertz antenna. So that is telling me that I believe that you can use 2.4 at the same time as you're using 10, due to the fact that they've got it wired up this way. So that seems to be good news. They've got the tri-band, I believe this is a tri-band vertical here. I can't quite see what the model number is, but I'm assuming that that's what it is. Going into the 270 and 23 centimeter port. They've got the 5.6 gig antenna coming out of this port here. You've got obviously the GPS, and then you've got the 10 megahertz reference into the transverter, and this accessory cable as well going back into the RF module. You've got the LAN cable which comes up in, and also you've got here the BNC connector, which runs down for the 10 megahertz out to drive the 10 gigahertz transverter. So the first comment was made by HF Radio Recordings. I'm curious about remotely mounting the RF unit. The video mentions it being waterproof, but with all those exposed RF connectors, I would think that a waterproof enclosure will be needed. So the first part of that question, I guess, is that in the promo video that Icom released, that they said that it is IP, I think it's X5 waterproof. So as far as the exposed RF connectors, not sure, but I suspect that they probably will be supplied with rubber boots that go over the top of the connector. It might be the case of just using some self-amalgamating tape or something to keep the water out. The enclosure itself, though, the RF module itself is waterproof, and it will be waterproof around the connectors as well. They also continue, while it would be nice to see 220 and 900, it's important to understand that these bands are only available in Region 2, so there's no sense in Icom including it. So that's actually a very good point. Probably the number one comment and question that I had on those videos was, why does this not include 220, 1.25 meters? Why does it not include 900 megahertz, which I think is 33 centimeters? Why doesn't it include those bands? So as rightly pointed out here by HF Radio Recordings, these bands are only available in Region 2, which is pretty much the Americas, but mainly the United States, where you have access to that spectrum. I can't answer why they weren't included, but can only assume that it's due to the fact that it's a very, very small niche market. Here in Australia, we don't have access to the 200 megahertz band. That's filled with digital television. 900 megahertz is used by our cell phone carriers, so we don't have access to these bands. So I just think it was just Icom making a decision to include the bands that are available universally worldwide for all amateurs. Andy also follows this up and says, I have to laugh at all the complaints about no 220 megahertz. Seriously, why would Icom go to all the trouble of an extra cost of hardware, bandpass filters and so on, special firmware, special versions, including a whole separate inventory to service a niche market which is irrelevant to most of the world? That's pretty much it. 3.4 gigahertz, you could also make the argument, why wasn't that included? That's probably also the same reason. Here in Australia, we have 3.4 gigahertz, although it is always constantly under threat. We have a small slice of spectrum, but it probably wasn't included because it's not widely available in the United States anymore. And why would they include it just to service Australia? So I can understand that. All of the bands that are available in the IC-905 are available to amateurs pretty much worldwide. Brian says, Hayden, how about doing a video about antenna and dishes for 2.4, 5.6 and maybe 10 gigahertz in readiness for the IC-905? Once the rig gets on the market, there is surely going to be a rush of activity on SHF. I did do, quite a number of years ago, I did a couple of videos experimenting with PCB log periodic antennas and also some other various antennas when I was doing some microwave stuff. That was mainly on 2.4 and 3.4 gigahertz, but the principles still apply for some of the higher bands. There is a link in the description below to a playlist with all of those videos, so you can check that out if you're interested. Johnny says, this certainly is a game changer. No other amateur radio manufacturer has ever put so much varied technology into a transceiver. Depending on the amateur television FM bandwidth, the picture quality can be remarkably good. I have many years of amateur television experience, and when we went from AM to FM, the ATV difference was amazing. Yes, digital is better, but FM and standard definition digital ATV are close in quality. Go Icom. So excellent comment there, Johnny. I tend to agree. It's great to see that amateur television was included in the radio, and it is also cool that it's built into the unit itself. Analog TV, really good. Would be good if it had digital television, but I'm going to cover that a little bit later on in the video and my thoughts on that. So this comment from Jacob here talking about the uses of the IC-905 comes from a few users saying, what's the point of this? I don't use these bands. What can we actually do? You can't talk very far. So Jacob says here, on 10 gigahertz, I've read of several hams in the UK in decades past who used to scatter 10 gigahertz SSB off thunderclouds and communicate over distances of several hundred miles. If one were to try that with a half-watt unit, it might work given a large enough dish. But if we don't have a way to interface an amplifier to these radios, the range will be fairly limited. Still, for all it is, I think that is something I will save for. So, yes, 10 gigahertz. Half a watt on 10 gigahertz actually goes a long way, especially if you couple it with a high-gain dish antenna. A few years ago, I was participating in a portable field day, and I managed to make contact, I think it was non-line of sight over maybe 50 kilometers on 10 gigahertz, and the signals were 5.9 plus 20. Huge signals. It's actually quite surprising. Jacob is also very right. So when you get to these higher frequencies, you can use things such as rain scatter. You can also bounce signals off of solid objects such as buildings or even mountains, as we do here. And you can just experiment. That's the whole point of amateur radio, is experimentation. And that's exactly what the IC-905 is opening up to those who previously didn't have that. And as far as distance goes on 10 gigahertz, you can have massive contacts over long distances if you have enough power and the right antennas. We actually have an amateur in my local radio club, Rex, VK7MO. He holds the VK Australian record on 10 gigahertz, and he did that on digital, of course, a little bit shorter. He could probably, I think he also tried it on SSB, and it was like 4x1 as well. So yeah, it's certainly possible with enough power and a big enough dish. So maybe we'll have a way to interface and amplify. Don't know. Megan says, I think it is excellent value for the ham who's only a casual enthusiast who might want to experiment with using these bands. That is exactly right, Megan. And this is what Icom and our catering for. They're enabling those who didn't have access to these bands before, who would have required special gear, so special transverters like I've got over here for the higher bands. They're now opening up that to pretty much anybody. Anybody can get on these bands. Now, use it or lose it. That's pretty much what the motto is when it comes to these bands. We have so many different people, so many different agencies who would love to have access to these bands, and they're always putting pressure on the wireless regulatory authorities in whatever country we're in to get access to these, to take them away from amateurs. So the more that we can use them and we can prove that we are using them and putting them to good use with our experimentation and whatever we're doing with amateur radio, the more chances are that we're going to be able to hold on to them. So I think that's exactly what Icom are doing. They're making it available for the casual enthusiasts or for those who wanted to use it but couldn't access it before. And I think that this comment pretty much just sums up exactly why Icom are innovative and they are interested in that space. Don says, do you know if any mention was made if it is full duplex for satellites? No, there was no mention about it. We can only go off the screenshots of the video and also what we've seen so far, which only shows one frequency. So I'd probably tend on the side of saying that it's not full duplex, but we won't know for sure until it's released and we can start to play around with it. Manuel says, this is why I like the Japanese brand radios. They're very creative and the quality is very good. Yes, I'm getting one for these. It is also very good for hams who live on high-rise apartment buildings. You can use a tri-band antenna to the 2 meter, 70 centimeter and 23 centimeter bands. Exactly right. So again, this opens up the radio, or these bands, to all sorts of people who may not have had it before. This comment was an interesting one, saying that this radio is ugly. I wouldn't exactly call it ugly. I actually like the layout of all of the Icom radios, and it's pretty much the same as the 705, which has a similar very layout to the other radios in its line. So I disagree with that. Only 10 watts output. Yes, it is only 10 watts output because it is a PoE powered radio. You've got the controller, which has all the power circuitry in it. It is powering the RF module, which is up on top of the tower over a LAN cable. There is only so much power that you can put over the LAN cable. So that's why it is limited to 10 watts. Going on further with that, Vinron says the 20 meter length is probably related to DC voltage of PoE sufficient to power 10 watts at the transceiver. It may even be a special Ethernet cable. Yes, I suspect, not sure, but I suspect that what they're doing is that the 13.8 volts that powers the controller, 905 controller, there's probably some sort of step-up converter in there to maybe 24 or 48 volts so that you don't get voltage drop along that PoE cable, and then that powers the RF module up the top of the tower. That's what I suspect that they will do to avoid the voltage drop. But again, there is only so much power that you can push over PoE. It is limited with its specifications. And on 2.4 and 5.8 gigs with the 2 watts output, that's actually quite surprising how far you can get. I mentioned that last weekend I was participating in a contest, and there was a lot of people running transverters just off the back of their dish, and they were running 2 watts into a 27 dBi gain antenna, and they were being heard all around town and over some pretty significant distances. It's really strong. So it's surprising. You don't need a massive amount of power to get a reasonable amount of distance. Richard says that curious the choice of SMA. I would think the N-type, as it covers the frequency range, would be more durable and have a longer reconnect life cycle. There's a word for that, I forgot. Yeah, I guess SMA is just used because that's, you see that on the back of Wi-Fi routers, and it's pretty standard SMA for the higher frequencies. N-type is also a lot bigger than an SMA, so for them to put several N-type connectors across the top, there probably isn't physical room. But yeah, SMA kind of makes sense, given that that's what is pretty much used in other commercial applications. Code Monk says, this is awesome, but I worry about the market demand, keeping stuff like this in production and other companies making similar products. Around here, people hardly even use UHF. It's all VHF and below. I can sort of understand where this comment is coming from, but I do have a bit of a story when it comes to this. Our radio club is roughly, I think it's around about 80 members now at the moment, almost 80 members. And out of those, we had, I think, a few years ago, before the IC-90700 come out at least, we maybe had 2 or 3 people on 23 centimeters, and they were the real dedicated operators. Now we have at least in the immediate area, I think we've got at least 20. I'm pretty sure it might even be 23, because I think we aimed for 23 on 23. So we've now got at least 20 operators. So that's what? That's 20. Oh, I shouldn't math on camera. That's 20%. Over 20% of our club members now have access to 23 centimeters. They don't all have Icom IC-9700s. Some have also got some other transverters which have been commonly available, and again, they just run those with just a couple of watts. But the interest was made in those bands, and eventually when one person was interested, the next person wanted to experiment, and then the next person wanted to get on it, and there was a bit of a flow-on effect. So I guess in some regards, if you get one or two people interested and then they, share that interest with someone else, then eventually the more people will get on those bands. So that's, I guess, what I'm hoping happens. And with the IC-905, that opens up the ability for everyone who didn't have access to these bands before to now have them all in one neat, really easy to use package. So another question which was coming up a lot was price. No idea. It only got released last weekend, so who knows? Just wait and see. No point speculating on what the price is going to be. A lot of people are saying it's going to be horrendously expensive. I'm not going to be able to afford it. But we just don't know until it comes out. So speaking about pricing though, and again, we still don't know what the price of the 905 is, but the benefit is with the 905 is everything's packaged in that one RF module with the exception of 10 gigahertz. When we look at other options to get on to say 10 gigahertz, have a look here at Down East Microwave. They've got here a 10 gigahertz transverter that does 10 milliwatts of output. That is $500. Now, if you want to bump that up and you want to get something, say, with a 3-watt output, ignoring, of course, the noise figure and other things that you may be interested in, it's $625. So it's not cheap to get on these bands. Conversely, Kune have a 10 gigahertz transverter, which these are the top of the range transverters, €655. That's about $651. So to get on these bands is not cheap. But the benefit, again, with the IC-905 is that everything is required to get you on air is available with what you purchase. With these options with the transverters, buying them standalone, you've still got to buy or have available an IF radio, so a radio to drive these. You also require some cables to be able to connect them all up together, relays, sequencers. You've got to find time to build all this stuff. You've got to weigh up the pros and cons when it comes to the pricing. It can be quite an expensive hobby, of course, but the benefit, I think, that with the 905 is that it makes all of these easily accessible. You don't need to buy all of these different bits, and it sort of does cater for those who may not necessarily want to build something or may not have the ability to build something. Other options as well, while I'm talking about it for these bands, is the SG Labs range of transverters. So they've got a 1296 meg transverter that does 2 watts again, so that's much lower power than the 10 watts, which is going to be on the IC-905. These are around about $200, I think, US when I bought them, $250 US potentially. They've also got a 2.3 or 2.4 gigahertz version as well, again 2 watts, so about the same as the IC-905. A little bit more expensive, $250, $300. You'll have to contact SG Lab for exact pricing. So I also have a little bit of a wish list now when it comes to this radio. I already think that it's fantastic. I think that it is going to be a game changer from Icom, and congratulations to Icom again for coming up with this when we saw the SHF project. Never did we think that we would get something like this. But there are a couple of things that I personally think it would be beneficial to be added to the IC-905. Now, a disclaimer, we still don't know a lot at this point. Some of these things that I'm going to mention may or may not be features in the radio. So just putting that out there. I'm trying not to speculate, trying not to say that this radio should have this because I think that it's already fantastic. I just think that these are some of the things that I personally would like to see if I was buying the radio. So the first thing is an external connection for amplifiers or preamps. So this would give us the opportunity to then boost the power for applications such as Earth, Moon, Earth, EME. EME on 10 gigahertz is very popular, despite what you might think. There are a lot of operators on 10 gigahertz EME doing digital data modes. So again, it might already be available. We saw that the 905 had an accessory port on the transverter at the socket at the bottom of the RF module. So there might be some pins available there to be able to wire up our own amplifier. Now, we'd obviously have to make it waterproof and mount it outside because of the losses between the transverter, the amplifier and the antenna. But it might be possible, depending on the noise figure of the RF module and the transverter. We're not quite sure what they are for the CX10G, but you know, it might not require a preamp, but for a power amplifier, that would be something which would be very beneficial. Full duplex for satellite modes. So we saw that there was a couple of comments about this. It kind of makes sense, and it might already be implemented. We're not sure. We can only go off the screenshots, as I mentioned before. The IC-9700 does the full duplex for satellites, and a lot of people use that with the automatic tracking, Doppler tracking and things like that. For QO100 for the geostationary satellite over there looking over Europe, it would make a lot of sense as well. So not sure. Could be just a firmware update or something. Don't know until it comes out. But yeah, full duplex for satellite modes would be cool. Now, amateur TV. So this was interesting that it was analog and not digital. Analog is, as we saw before, there was a comment, is still awesome and really good, really innovative. Good to see that it's on the screen, on the 905 screen itself. But it appears like it's composite video only, and it's hard to find composite monitors and cameras. Maybe I could hook up my Nintendo 64.
It's me, Mario!
To it, and I can game over the air. Maybe that's something that I could do, because that still has a composite video output. One suggestion, I guess, could have been is adding a digital TV encoder or decoder inside the controller. That may have been cost prohibitive though, or maybe even just a way of connecting the controller to a computer and then running it in software so that you just use the radio pretty much as a transmitter and a receiver, and you just pipe in your digital television and receive that way. That would have been cool. Imagine having a little mini HDMI on the side, and you could pipe your digital signal in, and you could transmit digital TV over the air, and all of your neighbours would be able to receive your digital TV transmission. You could have your own television station. But at the end of the day, we've got analog TV, so that's fantastic. So it'd be great to still play around with that, but digital TV would have been pretty cool. The only other thing was the 144, 430 and 1.2 on the one connector. So it would be good if Icom had an optional triplexer that you could buy, and then you could break that off to 3 separate antennas, because I can see a lot of people will be using 3 separate antennas. Maybe, see, one connector sort of limits you a little bit. Maybe even just another connector which is just for 23 centimeters. So you have 144 and 430 on one and 23 centimeters on the other. Or alternatively, it could just be something simple as a little pop-off plate you could just buy an end connector from Icom with a pigtail and plug it in, open up the RF module and plug in in that way. Pretty sure you'd be able to fit another end connector on the top there. I just think that it would be advantageous to be able to break off at least 23 centimeters away from 144 and 430, or to provide some way of breaking it off, so a diplexer. So the next question is well, what are some of the features that I didn't cover? What else does the radio come with? Well, I did a video on the promotional video that was released from Icom. You can view it right up here.